Great. Well, we've come to the end of, I think, a very energetic and interesting day. I'd like to take stock not just of the afternoon session, but of the whole meeting. So first of all, I want to echo what Ian said, that I think really this meeting has been, I think, sparked by optimism. I think, first of all, that everyone in this room has so much passion for really doing good for the community, that we can harness that passion and that energy into very, productive outcomes. And I think at the end of the day is how does all this translate down, to the level of graduate students and postdocs in the laboratories around the world. I mean, I think if things translate to that level, we know we've made a difference. And, I think this is an exciting meeting. A lot of meetings end and then nothing happens. It was a great discussion, but there's no follow through. And I would challenge us to really not think that way, that this meeting, again, it's not an end, it's a start. And also, it would be great, I'd like to take this opportunity right now to kind of imagine what the world would look like in 1 year, in a very pragmatic level. And also at some level, I think it would be wonderful if all of us here in this room and on the web and on the internet say, I was part of that conversation, and now, the world has advanced in a positive direction. I think that would make, all of us feel very energized that our time spent at this meeting was very valuable. And I think there are two elements of this meeting. One is that there are a lot of ideas that have been discussed here. I think the exchange of ideas is very important. I think there is this spirit that new experiments are going to be very valuable and very important. And I'll come back to that at the very end, I do think it's very important to drill down on issues with very great granularity that could have very significant impact, and also choose the ones that have the least barrier to implementation, so that we actually make some progress. So again, where is the intersection between where we can make a difference and where we can also take a very concrete steps forward. All these steps, whatever we discuss here today, has to be, followed by actual work, by actual, work done by the community. And I would argue for many people in this room have to be part of that follow through. So I will raise some issues here to put on the table. And then, of course, it's up for us to discuss. I think the issue of transparency in peer review, which we talked about in the morning, is potentially an issue that could fall under the category of large impact, where the timing may be appropriate for us to think about that as a very actionable item right now. One could argue, why hasn't it happened before? And, maybe the answer for that is not that we tried and failed, but really that it hasn't risen to the level of attention that that issue has deserved. And maybe this meeting and follow through, of course, could elevate the discussion to pay attention to that issue. So again, the question is, really, is transparency in peer review serving science well? I think that is the key question that we have to ask. And of course, like I'm afraid any issue that we think about, there's always benefit and there's risk. You know, we had that conversation with preprints before. We discussed the benefit, and of course, there are potential risks of preprints. But, you know, the question is, we have to think about, do the benefits really sufficiently outweigh the risks, and are the risks manageable? And is this a sensible move for our scientific community to take? And I would say in the issue of transparency and peer review, I think there are three issues that we discussed collectively. One is open reports, and that is, you know, the product of the peer review, the author response, and you know, editorial letter, but not necessarily open identity. And I want to like also break this down into, again, what might be manageable now in 1 year. Not to say that this is the end game, but that if we make some progress going forward, we can then get some traction into other issues that might follow on. So I think the three linked issues here are open reports, DOIs and discoverability. So that open report is actually, you know, possible to find. And the names of contributors to peer review, that becomes like you know, an accepted ethical standard. And so those are three issues that I'm putting to the table for all of us here today, whether that is a change in how we do business in science communication that we would actually like to see 1 year from now. And then the question is like, so I mean, it's not like this hasn't been tried, and we've discussed there are journals doing this. This is not some completely wild, you know, never been tried experiment. It is being done right now. The question is this something that our profession really wants to advance as standard practice of how we do business in science communication? So going from 2% of journals to something where maybe all journals want to buy in or they will feel left out. So, and can we get there in a year? That's a question I put on the table to people in the room. And as part of that question, I can also say that, you know, I think a couple key actionable items are, we've already developed a community here in this room, and we went through the exercise of, with preprints, of formulating a policy or, you know, a commentary statement on this issue, which had a large authorship group. I think that is an actionable item that we can really take on in a very, very thoughtful way, so we can drill down on the issue with more time than we even have to do right now and to rush through. Because I think discussing some of you know, the benefits and the risks in a very thoughtful way is absolutely critical. But it is a product that we could produce out of the meeting. I think, honestly, another conversation that needs to be had is, you know, with the funders. You know, is this something that funding agencies who are really supporting science, is this something that they actually want to see happen in the way we communicate our science? I think that is an actionable conversation that has to be had, and has to be had amongst the funders here. I mean, funders to scientists, funders to funders. But I think that is a question that we need to put forth and get an answer to. So I would say those are two, very discrete, actionable items that could, come out of the meeting. And I'll stop talking in a second and open this up. I think, in a very practical sense, where do we want to be in a year? And if we are there in the year, what does that open up in the future? And I think there could be things that open up in the future if we make that first step forward, such as the issue of recognition, which we all felt is a very important direction that we need to go in, in terms of having peer review be viewed as scholarship and an important activity of our community. I think transparency is the first step towards scholarship and then to recognition. So I think I'm putting this on the table, if we make that first step forward, we can get to the next step that we want to subsequently. I think there's also this feeling and hope that we could also open ourselves up to name ourselves at peer review and open up and have open identity. I think that's an aspiration. I think that individual scientists would like to get to eventually. And again, I think possibly with more transparency, with a kind of a better communal feeling around peer review, that opens up the possibility of also achieving that goal. So I think there are a lot of important goals to where we want to get. The question is, what is the path to get there? So, I will put those comments out for open discussion in the room here. And I laid out some very specific things. I also want to highlight the excitement around a lot of the ideas and the experiments that are happening, that were put on the table. And I think that's another important element that we also need to stimulate in the community, because through these experiments, we're going to learn, we're going to see what gets adopted, and we're going to be able to move things in a positive direction. So with that, I'll just open it up, to commentary.
Thanks, Ron. I want to add one little thing that I've said on previous occasions, a simple little addition to your simple little list of things that we should achieve in the next year, and that is, even before all referees are willing to sign their name, there's at least one person associated with each paper who really should sign his or her name, and that's the editor who was responsible for the decision. And that is true at every journal, and yet a lot of journals don't do that. And I have yet to hear a good reason why they don't take responsibility for their decision.
Are there any comments before we go on to another comment, are there any reactions to Randy's comment? Okay, well, maybe we'll move on. Yeah. I'm sorry.
I mean, we view it as being a decision that the editorial team makes, and not just one person. So, and in effect, every paper that comes out in the journal is the product of a discussion with the editorial team. So, because the team are all listed on the journal. So.
Well, since I have the microphone, I think there's always one editor who signs the decision letter, and I think that should be part of transparency, that is included. I totally agree.
Well, why not sign Debbie Sweet on behalf of the staff of Cell, whatever? What's wrong with that?
Okay, were you following up on this?
Just a brief, so I personally am not a fan of signing my reviews in general, when I have served as like a guest reviewer and editor for Eli, for example, there I think it's incredibly important that my name be associated with that. I think when you're the person directing and driving this, and so maybe that comment maybe is more about the academic editing process, and I would agree there at a much higher level than I would agree with that statement for just broad reviews, right? And I value the anonymity for generally our comments. The person who's shepherding the process and helping make the decision, I think, should be accountable.
Just to follow up, I mean, I'm Mark Johnson from Genetics. Of course, the editor should sign the decision letter. That seems obvious to me. But Randy, are you talking about also having the name published on the paper? Yeah, that's what our journal has long done. Oh, no.
Okay, well, if there aren't any more follow-ups, I had an idea of something we could do in the next year. And I guess I'd kind of meant this community. We could come up with a standard, our community practice, by which open peer reviews can be created and shared and made interoperable. The reason I say that is it seems to me like the role of an organization like ACEP Bio is really, really powerful in the building consensus around community norms, and having those norms in place would then allow each of the different communities to go off and build the things that they're going to build, but that they wouldn't be siloed. They would be able to be interoperable with one another, which is kind of what has happened in the preprint space, right? There wasn't one preprint server to rule them all. There were a whole bunch of different little preprint servers in a whole bunch of different little niche areas, but they all have some certain general common characteristics. So I think, one, coming up with a standard, our community, consensus around how to make these things interoperable would be a very positive thing that I think ACEP Bio is uniquely positioned to build consensus around.
I just wanted to follow up on the notion of experiment. I think in terms of transparency, we are now in the post-experimental phase. I mean, especially in areas like cell biology, molecular cell biology, which is quite conservative traditionally. I mean, journals such as eLife and EMBO have done this now for close to 10 years. And importantly, maybe to reemphasize that this has been done as an optional thing, and yet 97% of authors have opted into this system. So I think we're beyond experiment. This has been adopted already by the community and journals that have done it, so we can actually pretty much come to an agreement that it works.
So this is
talking about
Transparency in the sense of publishing reports, publishing the editorial decision letters.
So this is Neil, and I wanted to respond to your question about funder needs. And from my particular perspective, it seems like there are really two things. And the first is we've been identifying some significant issues with rigor. And so the question would be, how would a big shift in peer review to make it open, how would that enhance rigor? And I suppose there's lots of ways it could, and perhaps there's ways it couldn't, depending on how things are implemented. And then the second thing is whether the reviews are really rich and fantastic and open, or if they're secret and sloppy. The thing that gets transmitted to our reviewers are references, citations that have author names and title and journal title, and all of that rich detail, good or bad, doesn't necessarily come through. And so how would we convey the signal that something is better, something is richer going on, other than through that reference? Or can we amend the reference? And that seems like a fundamental issue to me.
Sorry, I'm trying to understand that. Can you say that last point again?
Sure. So you look at a biosketch, it's got a qualitative section that's written by the applicant, and then it's got 4 citations that back up that qualitative section. And the biosketch the references just have reference information, including the journal title. So the natural inclination is to look at the name of the journal to judge the quality of the citation. Now, that journal could be doing open review and it's really rich and thoughtful, or they could be doing really bad review and it's secret. But you can't tell by looking at that citation. And so what information, what signal are we sending to the reviewers, which is different under open review, if it's all mediated through that single reference? And there could be lots of ways around that, but unless we get all the great information that comes through open review to the reviewer in a meaningful way, the peer reviewer for a grant application, then our grant application process isn't going to benefit from open peer review for journal articles.
Yeah, I mean, I guess on that point, if the change goes from 2% to 80%, then, most citations in a biosketch will have an accessible peer review associated with it, because most journals are participating in that expected standard. So it's not going to be like a needle in a haystack. It's going to be standard practice. And if they're DOIs and they're put through Crossref, it's possible to easily find them. So, I mean, I think I think that would be the idea, that
The idea is that the reviewer will read the citations, look up the reference.
I mean, the idea thing that if a reviewer wants to find any peer review on any piece of literature, that is possible if they want to do so. I mean, that would be the aspiration. Yeah. And, it does not seem, we discussed like how big of a effort is that, to do. It's going to take journals extra time, but it's maybe a matter of priority. If at the minimum it takes someone a half an hour to integrate a PDF and assign it a DOI, then we're not talking about like a giant technological breakthrough here in the implementation. It's more like a decision whether this is something that I would say the system overall, and the system means journals, scientists, funders, cooperatively working together to decide this is something that we should do. Jeremy, do you have a comment?
No.
Oh.
I was just wondering let me just ask a rhetorical question from the funder. So funders can nudge behavior. We've pretty much all got open access policies. We could, for example, suggest that to comply with our open access policy, there has to be an open review. Would that be effective? I mean, that's doing stuff sort of top down rather than collaborative. We could go further, say that reviewers have to be signed. We could be radical. Is this an opportunity for us to really think how we can change peer review? I think what you're suggesting is good there, but they sound like quite small baby steps. I wonder if there's time for a slightly more ambitious vision.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, I think even the baby step is a giant step. I mean, when you really think about where we are in the entire system, where peer review is not available, where we don't know who were the contributors to peer review, just this simple step, I would say, is like a giant leap for mankind. I mean, compared to where we are right now. I mean, this is part of the discussion. Is this really a baby step? I mean, I would argue probably from where we are right now, it's not. And it's accessible. I mean, honestly, if everyone just left this room, I think Mike Eisen was raising that point. If all of us just left this room, this is what happened with preprints. We left the room and say, let's just submit preprints. I think if all of us left the room and just said, well, why not? Why shouldn't we make peer reviewing a transparent process? Because it's good for science. If we left the room and just said that, there's really not much barrier, to having that happen. So, I suppose I'm always very pragmatic. But I think to somehow, if we miss that opportunity because we're trying to extend too far, and we miss, the step that's right in front of us, maybe we're missing a giant opportunity. So that would be my argument there. But yeah,
I'll follow up on that. I'll say that, it's apt that you use the giant leap for mankind analogy because that happened on the moon, right? Like they started with people having a big ambition and knowing where they wanted to get to, and the giant leap for mankind that happened to be a small step was on the moon. So, I'd like to echo that sentiment that, we started the meeting with a I think bold and visionary kind of call for really rethinking the way we do peer review from Aaron. And I think it would be too bad if we leave with without engaging with that. I understand and agree with everybody that we should take we should take the steps in front of us. And I completely endorse the idea that we should leave here and make open peer review happen. But I think this case is maybe a little different than preprints because preprints there was a very tangible, thing in front of us that didn't require a lot of thinking or knowledge about what we were trying to get to. But I think this peer review is different, and I think we need to have some kind of idea of what we're working for in the long run. What's the goal, so that we make these small steps in the right direction. And I think I would like to see us kind of engage at least a little bit with what Aaron said, so we can have that sense. Maybe we don't all see it in the same way. I don't think we do, but at least we individually have some idea about where we're trying to get to.
No, I agree. Well, and also another way to put it is if we think about open, transparent peer reports and, acknowledging, at least identifying contributors, at least to the journals, have we made a step in the wrong direction that precludes any opportunities in the future? I would argue that probably the answer to that is no. But
I think it's also worth keeping in mind that if we just did that and nothing else, and we thought our work was done, then we would have wasted an opportunity.
Yeah. I agree with you. Everyone in this room can take initiatives and push them as far as they can. It's not like, we're saying there's a little box here and everyone has to behave within the little box. Of course, ingenuity and innovation and the spirit of that is the spirit of science, right? That is what we do. Although, I will say a lot of meetings, and I'm sure all of you have been to meetings where the meeting concluded and nothing happened. And so if there are additional action items that we feel compelled that, we should do, as a collective, then I think now's a great time to put them on the table. But I'm also trying to identify things that all of us can rally behind as something.
Can I offer one that I think also plays along with that, which is, we have a lot of scientists. I think the big thing that happened at the last meeting was we had a bunch of scientists who went out and just started posting preprints and telling their friends to post preprints. And, we have F1000 Research, which is doing, I think, great forward-looking things with the way that it's publishing and doing peer review. If all the scientists in this room who had papers used the same kind of energy that went into promoting bioRxiv to now try to, in this sense, participate in post-publication review, both by sending papers there and by participating in the review process, I think we will have made a really important, tangible step forward in getting that side of what we've been talking about going, and it's, you know, it's tangible. You could do it tomorrow. It's a real step in the same spirit. Although a step more aggressive than that. So.
Cory?
Well, I was just yes, but I was just going to actually just ask you to clarify. So, are you talking about suggesting that the reviewers notify the journal that they plan to post their reviews autonomously, or that they review, or that authors select venues that offer open reports?
I'm saying even further. Like, I think, where the difference between what F1000 Research is doing and other places is they've shifted to a fully post-publication review model, and I think that again, not everybody thinks that that's the future, but for those people who do, we have a tangible way to endorse it right now, which is to participate in the one extant manifestation of this system. So if others pop up, I think we should do it. Like, this has always been what's missing, is we've talked about these things for 2 decades, and we haven't put our money where our mouths are. And I think we should all be doing that. And also in open peer review, I think it's the same thing. Like, scientists have a chance to speak with our papers, and I think it's the most important thing. It's the most important thing we should do, and we shouldn't focus all our attention on what journals do, because it's ultimately scientists who make the choices.
So there's a scary risk. I might agree with Mike, at least in part, and that is that I think that the previous ASAP Bio success came from asking individual scientists to do quite a small thing, try posting a preprint, see what happens, and it worked. That's great. When a meeting like this says, well, we want the editor of Science to commit to open peer review at Science and ditto the editors of other journals, that's asking for change from different actors in a different way, and I'm not sure how achievable it is. And then small steps definitely help. So I think it's really important to decide: is this about saying to individuals, here's something you can do. Sign every review you write. There's a starting point. Or is it about saying we're trying to get journals and publishers and an ecosystem to do something differently? And I think then you, Ron, identified how difficult it is to achieve culture change.
We haven't tried yet.
I have a question. It's somewhat separate. So there's post-publication review, there's preprint review, but there's the review that we have now, which is closed in some places and open in others. And so my question is actually for Debbie and Theo and Philip. So in terms of what people could do, I could go home now and take the last paper I published, post all the reviewers' comments, post my responses to those comments, and put them somewhere, right? I don't know who those reviewers were. Would that cause you all to, you mentioned something about a problem, is that outside of the agreement that we have with the journals?
So it isn't a problem if you published your papers in the BMJ, because we post them, so you can point to them. But I think with most journals, you undertake not to do that. You undertake that the peer reviews are confidential. So. Yeah.
Well, yes, but actually I've been thinking I wanted to raise a different point, which is something that came up in the discussions, and I'd like to hear from people who actually write reviews about this. Because one of the ideas I thought was interesting was the idea of structuring the reviews to make them more portable, to make them more useful across different journals. And we've tried to do that in the past, tried to get people to change the structure, and it's actually surprisingly difficult. People are quite resistant. They like their free-form flow. So people who actually write reviews in this room, would you be willing to, I mean, and that actually might be a tangible outcome for this meeting as well, is to come up with a suggested structure that you feel would, or we feel would help with portability. That would be something that we could recommend, and then that would be something we could use. So I'd like to hear from the people who write peer reviews about whether you'd be open to doing that, whether you'd be okay with that, having a more standardized structure.
Yeah, my answer is no. I just hate filling in forms, no matter what. And I write the review the way I write it. I don't see, but I think Corey's question needs to be answered.
I think that's a great idea. And I think that, we do this all the time, submitting the NIH grant, like the review form changes, there's a new thing that you have to fill out. You're asked to respond to impact, for example. And I think we are flexible enough to adjust to that. I think one way to sort of enforce that is that you create separate entry boxes on the website, and that you actually have to enter them in separate places. And there might be some redundancy, and it's going to take people a little while to get used to that. But I think it's pretty easy to take what you've written and adopt it to that form, and we do that all the time for everything.
I'd be willing to do something like that if it meant you could transfer more easily to different journals.
So, Jody Rosenblatt, I just wanted to clarify with, I think we heard some really nice slides from Ron and also from Aaron last night about kind of what the whole process looks like. And so I think it would be helpful to just think about it from beginning to end and how that would look like. So I like the idea of this, I think we're all good with the preprint idea. Everybody seems, and I like the preprint journal club. I think that got a lot of traction. I thought that was really interesting. And then, there's a jump between what happens when it goes, does it then go to the journals, and what role do the editors play? I like this idea of thinking about the author decides when it's acceptable. I think that's a really interesting idea. But also, like, do you have a Tinder sort of site where the journals go through and rate, swipe right or something, if they're interested in it. So, I mean, I think it would be kind of interesting to think about the whole process. A little more granularity.
Back to Debbie's point, I mean, I agree with Sam. If it helps transparency and in the end reduces everybody's burden, great. But the journals would have to agree on something. I don't know. Would you do that? And what would that be? I don't really. I don't understand it from my side where that would help. And could you agree on something? But again, back to that small step. We, the scientists in the room, can't do anything to make, or we can ask the journals to publish the reviews and be transparent. We can't do it for them. We might be able to refute, to force them by saying, we'll stop refereeing for you unless you publish. That would be, well, the preprints, yes, but we're talking about the journals. Why stop with the preprints? There's no need to stop with the preprints. Let's go, the whole way for everything. So how do we do it? And the journals still haven't said anything about it.
Yeah. That's actually what I'm suggesting. Earlier around the standards, I think journals would accept a more structured, form of review and get people to do that if it made reviews more portable, if it made them more interoperable, and if they're going to be open, then people are going to want to do interesting things with them, like use them to identify good reviewers for grant panels and things. And for that, they're also going to need to be a little more structured. Having silos is not good for data. It's not good for papers. It's not going to be good for reviews. So I think that's exactly the kind of thing that ASAP Bio particularly could do, is to get all the publishers that we have here in this room to come together on kind of what you need for reviews to be interoperable. I think it's really one of the most powerful things we could do.
So I very much want to support your pragmatic approach for the year ahead. It's not as if that's all I would take away and strongly recommend, and it's going with the grain of what we're doing anyway, but I think this meeting, expressing it in that way, adds focus to the internal discussions and could help us put pressure on the technology support, which we would need for some of that. We are working with other people, as our people here, on the credit taxonomy and really trying to get author contributions into a better shape. So that's just an example of how we can work together. And the structuring of referees' reports. I'd always thought of that as a no-no, rather in the same spirit as Maria just expressed. But actually, if you can point out the benefits in terms of portability and in terms of helping referees to focus on just what you want them to focus, so you're actually reducing a burden, that sort of consideration could make, I think, everybody change. And whether you'd all agree exactly on a format, I wouldn't know. So I do, and I'm not in any way suggesting that the bigger vision that Erin spelt out yesterday is something that we would necessarily oppose, even if that sounds like voting for Christmas as a turkey. Because definitely there were things in there that I personally wouldn't support, but that's just me, and I'm sort of steeped in history. So 17th century. So I'll stop there because I'm.
But I do want to, before you give up the microphone, I mean, I guess what you're saying for the journals that you represent, that if the scientific community comes to you and says, we would like, as a community, to have, peer review open.
Yeah.
I mean, this is part of the question. If we come to the journals with that, saying this is for the best of science, we feel this is the best, we've discussed it.
Yeah.
We feel it's for the best of science. We feel it's going to, advance science. It's going to advance an understanding of peer review. And we came to you.
Yeah.
Obviously, you have to reciprocate by saying, yes, we understand that value and we will try to, implement that request as part of our service to the community. Right. That is the kind of pact, where journals and scientists should be partners.
Right.
So, I mean, this is what I think scientists are asking in the room, that, okay, well, this is something we don't control. So we have to come to you and you have to respond.
Right. So I exactly. No problem.
So anyway, could you answer that, or?
Well, no. I mean,
not the subscription part.
No. I mean, the point is, we are already doing some of these things, but I mean, I know that you'd expect me to say this, but there is an ethos of serving the author as best as we can. I know it doesn't feel like that at times, but definitely that's something that we're trying to do. And it is a step at a time. It absolutely is a step at a time. Unless the scientific community can step a monumental leap, which can happen with the internet. I mean, you can suddenly change things, and we just have to go with you. But in terms of our willingness to move in these directions, it's definitely there. But there are all sorts of practicalities, and this group is not representative of the whole of science. And there are certainly different attitudes from the chemistry community, for example, notorious for its conservatism and so on. I mean, not wholly different. So I don't want to go on about that. But there is a spirit there, definitely, where we would respond positively. Speaking for the Nature Group.
Can I build on that? So I was thinking about about Dora, and I was wondering if maybe, as well as some kind of workshop report or outcome, it might be worthwhile going a step further and producing a declaration or something on responsible peer review, or commitments to move towards transparency in peer review. And this might help, for example, these editorial boards who would like to, who may wish to move towards more transparency, but then don't have leverage with publishers. But if they have, if there is some sort of public campaign or some sort of firm declaration that they can point to, then this might help in coordinating those activities. So this might be one concrete outcome that could come from this. The declaration on peer review.
Yeah, I agree. Maybe we'll just take a couple more comments, because it's been a very long day, and I know there's a beer waiting or a glass of wine waiting for all of you, and dinner. So, Sue.
I just wanted to follow up on this idea of the publishers listening to the scientists, and I had two ideas that I just wanted to float, and maybe it can't be answered right now, but One was following up on Corey's question. I guess what I'm wondering is if the scientists, as our papers were accepted, so rather than saying that there's only like 3 journals that we'll now submit our papers to because they already have open access, if what we're really trying to do is to get all journals to shift, how would it work if we came to you after the review process and said, would it be possible for us to even create the PDF to be published? Do you see what I mean? So like we could actually be involved in helping initiate this. So that would be one question I have is how would journals react to that? And then 2, just again, because it's time and money and resources, what if the first step were that the journals decided to make it an option for the authors? So yeah, maybe everyone doesn't buy in right away, and maybe that's actually easier because you don't have to like suddenly hire someone to curate every single thing. But if when I submitted a paper to genetics, you know, I could check a box that said, yes, I'd like everything to be open later. And then that would just be a way for the journal to slowly shift or maybe just, you know, shift in a way that they can handle it a little more easily. So those were just 2 things I was sort of curious. And maybe Mark could answer the question about how would you feel if I asked you if I could make a PDF and even if the journal doesn't want to publish it, could, like Corey said, could we just post it on our websites ourselves or something?
Yeah, well, there's more involved than just making a PDF to the publishing process. So you could do that, and I'm not sure it would help us very much. But I think we are, especially the society journals, are responsive to the community. A good example is that Genetics was the first journal outside of the Cold Spring Harbor family to partner with bioRxiv. And the reason we did that is because our population genetics authors came to us and said, we really want to post preprints. And so we did it with John in 2013. So we are responsive, and I think all the society journals certainly are responsive because they're run by scientists. They're run by the community. So I think that's the place to go for establishing all of these things that we want to do.
They are established. Let's not forget that. We're talking as if we're trying to start a revolution here. Several are going to do this. Nothing new needs to be established.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. Very good point. Maybe we'll, I guess,
I want to direct this question to Phil. At the session earlier today, you said that Nature was going to be posting reviews. Will you affirm that for us right now?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think that's a big step. If you do that, others will follow.
Okay, well, that pretty nice closing set of interactions, but I think that's the kind of spirit that we want to go forth in this meeting. Just one quick announcement. So tomorrow is an opportunity for this unconference kind of breakout sessions where we can drill down on like 7 topics that people at this meeting have kind of self-organized. Do you want to say a word about organizing that, or? Yeah.
Well, there'll be more information tomorrow, but if you look at the Google Doc, there are now room assignments for 7 of these sessions. And so you can continue to sort of, indicate interest if you like. We'll hear in the morning some brief overviews from each of the leaders, and then we'll have an opportunity for you to switch between the sessions halfway through. Just want to make a brief announcement that dinner will be at 7, so we have a very brief break in between, but I'll give the podium back to Ron.
Well,